Alright, it's been a little bit since my first episode of this series, and after giving all the albums I mentioned a couple listens, I think I'm ready to make another. The concept is pretty simple. I tell you 5 albums that, quote, everyone should hear that I just haven't listened to yet, and then I let you know my thoughts on the previous 5 that I mentioned in the last episode, and I update you on how I feel about them now. There's not a whole lot more to it than that, so let's get started with some records that I have yet to hear. So, I've been on a decent classic hip-hop kick, but for the most part that hasn't really extended much further back than the 90s. Not that there's a ton of 80s hip-hop comparatively, but to say that there's no classics at all would be a bold-faced lie, and De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising is a perfect example of that. The thing is, I've not heard it, not even a little bit. The answer for why that is pretty simple, and likely the main reason most of you who haven't heard it haven't either. And that's that it was completely unavailable on any kind of streaming service until just a couple months ago. There's a lot of drama around why that is, which I won't get into here, mostly because I don't actually understand it, but with the passing of member Trugoy the Dove, it looks like the label decided to give in and put in the work to get this and all of their albums onto Spotify and Apple Music. I'm extremely excited to give this debut a listen, and I hope that it stands the test of time the way that I'm told it does. A genre that I don't have as much familiarity with as I'd like is post-punk. It's not that I haven't listened to very much of it, I certainly have, but I feel like I'm missing a key element in what makes it such an important and beloved genre. I'm hoping that what I've heard about Wire's debut album, Pink Flag, is accurate, and that it will bridge the gap for me between traditional punk and post-punk, and hopefully give me a greater appreciation and understanding of the genre they sat right at the cusp of. Expecting very good things from this one. Perhaps a little less of a hailed classic than the others I've talked about in this series so far, but my understanding is that Bloc Party are one of the biggest and most influential bands in the whole scene of post-punk revival, and considering how much I loved the new Paramore record, which I'm told drew heavily inspiration from the band's debut, I figured what better time than now to give them a listen. On top of that, I'm actually seeing this band open for Paramore in just a couple months, so call this preparation for that, I suppose. Hoping this is one of the better rock albums of the 2000s, as it's been said to be. Taking a pretty sharp change of pace, but staying into the 2000s, I actually have never listened to Bon Iver at all. My friends all love him and tell me that I would too, but I simply have never gotten around to it. I decided to go with his most critically acclaimed record, For Emma Forever Ago, and also I understand it to be his most traditionally folky record in his catalog. I honestly don't have much to say about this one for now, I just hope it delivers and is as beautiful as that artwork really is. And finally, a genre I've been giving a ton of time recently is post-hardcore. I might even make a video about all the different post-genres with how much I've been listening to them as of late, but for right now, post-hardcore is definitely my current obsession. No Means No is from Canada, and they're one of the most beloved post-hardcore bands out there, but because they aren't on Spotify, I've literally just been too lazy to give them a shot. But that stops here, and I'm beyond excited for this one because basically everyone whose music opinions I respect claims this as a masterpiece. Extremely looking forward to this. And now, back to the records I hadn't heard last time, let's update you on my thoughts on those now that I've had a couple months to live with them. First off, I want to talk about The Ascension by Glenn Branca. This thing is just as chaotic and nightmarish as I expected, with some of the most noisy and dissonant tones I've ever heard layered so thickly over each other and played so sporadically that at times it feels almost random. But the genius of this thing is that it isn't. Every second of this, to my understanding, was composed note for note and orchestrated all at once. Multiple guitars cut through each other and make this swarming wall of bees, and the bass punches right through intermittently. Where it should be the thing tying everything together and keeping it stable, instead it feels more like a bludgeoning tool that adds more chaos than it ever could hope to remedy. But the thing that surprised me most in this record was not the abrasiveness or the violence of the composition, but rather the moments where I would realize, oh, wow, I don't know when it happened, but this just became something beautiful. The noise and chaos of the pieces makes for uncomfortable listening much of the time, but it also allows for these really gradual shifts into melody that you can't pinpoint the start of, but when you realize it's happened, it's the most transcendental thing ever. This is also very, very obviously one of the most influential albums to extreme rock music ever. Swans, Sonic Youth, and basically every other no-wave or noise rock band this side of the Pacific owes their existence, or at least their sound, to the innovations that Glenn Branca put forward here. And yet, for all of its influence, I still don't think I've ever heard something that sounds like this, and I kind of doubt I ever will. My favorite track would either be The Spectacular Commodity or Lightfield in Consonance. Next, let's talk about my introduction to one of the biggest alternative rockers of the 90s in PJ Harvey's To Bring You My Love. It's actually interesting that this was my choice to listen to first because after listening to it and reading up a bit more on it, I've come to understand that this is actually a very clear crossing point where her sound transitioned from the hard-rocking, grungy sound of her earliest material into the more down-tempo and singer-songwriter type stuff she did from this point onwards. I haven't actually heard any other records of hers yet, I plan on it soon, but I will say, from this listen, I feel I made the right choice where to start. There's a lot of styles of 90s alternative music on here that may not be blended all that much, pretty much split up amongst the tracks, but I feel like it gives me a pretty good overview of what I can expect going forward, be it the down-tempo hit single Down by the Water, the acoustic rock track Come On Billy, which I think is my favorite, the punk blues on the opener, or the hard-rocking Long Snake Moan. All of it is led by PJ's unbelievably charismatic delivery and vocal chops, which are the biggest part of what has kept me returning to this record. Her voice is raw and unique in how breathy and husky it is, while still maintaining a super impressive range, which I think she displays best on the final track, The Dancer. This is a record that has me unbelievably excited to check out the rest of her catalog, and maybe finding a new obsession. Okay, so third, let's talk about Yoshimi, which, as I anticipated, came as the biggest shock to most that I hadn't heard it. I recently talked about The Soft Bulletin in a video, and alluded to the fact that I heard and enjoyed this record even more, and yeah, this is just absolutely beautiful and builds on all the things I loved most about the previous record, with a concept album bent that I had kind of clued into just by looking at the track list, but upon listening to it, it felt so natural and so integral to the spirit of the record. The other thing I alluded to in my Mucor video is that this album was a lot more emotional for me, and I stand by that wholeheartedly. The contrasts between emotional extremes here blend so well and lend this aching sense of melancholy to every song here, from the flawless opening statement of Fight Test to the silly scenario giving all the emotional weight of a real life or death battle on the title track, or the ultimate depressing happy song, Do You Realize? The flow of the album also beautifully lends itself to emotional investment with perfect pacing and every song lyrically leading into the next. I'll be seeing this album played live in its entirety this summer, and I really hope they keep this track order and don't intersperse it with too much other material because I can hardly think of a record paced better than this one off the top of my head. So yeah, this is my favorite Flaming Lips record of the 4 I've heard so far, and I think it will be a pretty hard one to top, even though Embryonic came pretty close. This more than lived up to the hype, and it's a record I'll be returning to for a good long while. The next 2 records here are genuinely some of the best music I've heard in my life, so I saved them for last. The first of these 2 would be that Boredoms record, Vision Creation New Sun. I'm not sure how to even talk about this one because even though I've heard it 3 or 4 times now, it kind of just baffles me every time with how energetic and life-affirming it truly is. I think the thing that spoke to me the most on the whole thing is how unbelievable the drummer here is. I feel like above everything else, the drummer is the lead instrumentalist on this record, and everyone else is just giving texture to that performance. In that sense, it reminds me a lot of the Don Caballero album I heard, but not quite as exclusively drum heavy. The synths, guitars, and vocals are not to be de-emphasized in my praises of the record, though. In particular, the synthscapes, which I think truly make the record the sonic dreamscape it is, with so many different tones and timbres that I would be at a loss to pinpoint just one to describe, that they're all perfect. I'm having a lot of trouble really accurately describing this record, honestly, because I think it intentionally evades description. It's so holistic and varied and long that trying to analyze any given moment or aspect feels like missing the forest for the trees. All I can say then is that you owe it to yourself to give this record a fair shake. I can't imagine you'll regret it. Last, and the literal opposite of least, is my surprise favorite record this go around that really snuck up on me and became a bit of an obsession, and that's Brian Eno's solo debut, Here Come the Warm Jets. This thing is so full of life and the joy of music, and by staying in the relatively well-understood lane of glam rock, it allows all of the crazy and weird experiments to go down without a hitch. Eno's vocals were something that initially I was worried would be a stopping block, but when I actually listened to the record, I came to adore them and find them to be more than tolerable, but actually a majority of why I love the album so much. He's got such a sarcasm to him that makes it feel so unserious and fun, but never too wacky that it gets in the way of the art here. And let me be clear, this is some wacky music. There's some of the most wild and out there rock experimentation I've ever heard, much less heard in music from this time period. My favorite track on the album, Baby's on Fire, contains a heavy contender for the best guitar solo I have ever heard, bordering on noise for a large swath of it, but also experimenting with the tones used and the timing of when they are and aren't active. The sonic manipulation on the whole record is truly something else, be it the sweeping noise on Cindy Tells Me, the crazy synths on track 2, and of course, the closing title track, which is basically proto-shoegaze and one of the most emotionally impactful instrumentals ever, and I can't even pinpoint why. Maybe it's because it was sampled on that Injury Reserve album. Either way, there's so much I could say about this record, and eventually I probably will talk about it again in greater detail, but for now I'll say that this is a record that grows on me every single time I listen to it, and it's showing no signs of stopping. Not only do I think it's Eno's best rock work, but it even rivals his flawless ambient catalog as well. I cannot wait to listen to this thing again and again. So that's the first full-scale episode of this series done. Sorry about the wait, I hope to get the next one out much sooner than this. As with last time, I'm going to link my Rate Your Music in the description so that you can find albums that I haven't rated and put them in the comments down below so I know what essentials you think I'm missing. Thanks to my patrons, as always. If you aren't subscribed there already, we've just established a new rule where every day is Shoegaze Sunday, so join if you like shoegaze and or Sundays. You'll hear from me soon enough.